Well, thank you all for joining us. You are the original three angry people in a pub that has become the legend of 2025. And what I wanted to do as we're approaching our anniversary of that, and those 5 years have flown by, we're glad that you could all join us to just reflect on what started 2025, what caused you to do it, what caused you to sort of come together and think about doing something different, and then hopefully in the end to think about what we should be doing for the next 5 years. So Margaret, I'm going to come to you. You were kind of the ringleader at the beginning and the first chair of 2025. So back in 2014, when we first met, actually, it seems like we've known each other for longer than that, but that's when we first met. Was there one particular event or something else that made you really feel you had to do something about health inequalities in North Wales?
I think it was a coming together of a number of things, actually. So the first one was, well, most of them were personal, but then the political small p is always personal, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'd just finished my master's degree in public health at Glyndŵr University, and that for me had joined up lots of bits of my life as going there as a mature student was actually life-changing in lots of ways. And it suddenly all made sense. And a lot of that was around inequality at the higher level. I'd stepped into the role as vice chair of the health board in North Wales, and one of the reasons for going for that role was that a social prescription service which had been run in Flintshire and Wrexham for the previous 8-9 years, which was absolutely wonderful, had been finished because the health board had pulled the funding and they just didn't get why it worked and what value it added. So I was angry about that. And again, a chance meeting with Clare's predecessor, Graham Worthington, with myself and the then chair of the health board. And, you know, it was one of those sort of come in and have a cup of coffee type chat. So actually the reason he wanted to have a cup of coffee was because there was a message on behalf of all the people leading the housing sector at the time across North Wales, which was that you guys, and it was predominantly guys in the health board, are really difficult to get in the room to talk about the contribution that housing could make to the health agenda. And because in North Wales, in Wales, we've got integrated health boards and have had them since 2009, but never maximised the potential of having those structures and still haven't. It was a wonderful opportunity and an open door to do something or try and do something a little bit different. So I tried to get the guys in the room, needed allies to do that, which is where Clare and Paul and eventually you came in, Ken. And it took me nearly 10 months. And I can be fairly persuasive, as I think you all know, but it was a hard few months to get people to commit to even sit in the same room.
So
that was February 2015.
So there's something in there then about kind of a little bit of resilience and stamina to get these things going as well. So Paul, what about you? What brought you to the table?
Very, very similar. I think mine was pure frustration at the difficulty of making anything happen. Back in the day, there was a North Wales chief executives group for housing associations, and I took the lead on health, and that got me a place on the stakeholder reference board of the Betsy Cadwallader University Health Board, and that's where I met Margaret, I think, and I recall sort of expressing some frustration after a meeting when we had a brief chat one day. And it went back to a meeting that was quite bizarrely, I must have taken the minutes because I still have them. You may think I should have thrown some of these things out by now, but I came across them on a memory stick. And it was a meeting between the Housing Association chief executives and directors of the health board in May 2012. It was a really, it felt really positive to be in the meeting. It was wide ranging. We looked at possibility of joint working, how we could collaborate on areas of mutual interest. We looked at there was a reorganisation of the health sector going on at the time, with reducing the number of sites across North Wales, and we looked at how we could help and the consultation. And after all that, the one agreement that came out was that we should meet again in 6 months. How familiar was that as a scenario, as an outcome of a meeting, unfortunately. And that, I remember, I think it was getting to the end of doing the notes to circulate and thinking, wow, is that all we got? Is that where we got to with this? And then 6 months came and went. The consultation had a rocky period, I think. I don't honestly recall whether we actually met again or not, but I think it was probably after that I vented my frustration at the stakeholder reference group meeting. And then that dovetails into the picture that Margaret's just painted of how we came together.
So you were already grumpy before the anger set in, then, in terms of just a lack of contact and engagement, and seeing these inequalities continue. Is that fair? Yeah,
I was a grumpy younger man then. I was a trainee grumpy old man. I'm now fully qualified.
and a mentor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. That's a great start. Claire, you were at Flintshire Council at the time, weren't you, as a chief officer?
Was, and I'd been working quite closely with Margaret in her previous role at Age Connect, and we've done quite a lot of work together around social enterprise development and social prescribing type services. But I think the moment for me was looking at some stats around life expectancy, and realising that life expectancy was still very, very different in different parts of Wales. And when I started to look at those figures in more detail, realising that life expectancy was much shorter in the poorer communities, and the poorer communities were where most of the social housing was. And knowing that there was a huge investment programme going on across Wales, so it wasn't anything to do with the condition of the houses that was allowing people to live lives with more ill health and to die much sooner, but it was something much broader than that and much more complex around inequality. So when Margaret contacted me around her frustrations around how do we get health and housing talking more together, because housing providers could be playing a much more significant role in helping to let people have healthier lives, I just sort of jumped at the opportunity. And I've never been one to shy away from something difficult. If it's the right thing to do, you just have to crack on. So it was great really to connect with Paul and Margaret and start to think about what we could do to make some positive changes.
So thank you all for that. I think there's some real common themes, aren't there? Is working with people that you know, working with willing people, and you can generally sense that quite quickly. I think that was something that Margaret and Paul and you have said, Claire, and then also perhaps starting to think about what you can actually work on is a challenge as well. And I suppose, so I'm going to come to you, Claire, to begin the next sort of area of discussion, because one of the things that I think we all recognise when we got together, and we're all a bit blurry about when that might be. I don't know whether that's because we met in a pub or whether it's just that we've done a lot subsequently. But I remember our first meeting, wherever it was, we talked about, you know, the power of social movement and some of the things that I'd started to learn elsewhere, and we felt that's probably what we wanted to do. Although, if we're all honest, we certainly hadn't tried on a social movement at that time, so we weren't really sure what it was. But we knew it meant not jumping into solution. It meant working with the right people, taking our time to work on the problem rather than going, I've seen this work somewhere else. Because that was one of the things that struck me, you know, in the early 2015, February time, I think, when we had our first event at the Optic, and my first experience of Glyndŵr, who had been through this discussion, listening to Margaret, was that we spent quite a lot of time with our first gathering working on what we thought the problem was. And what our purpose might be as emerging from that, and lots of data. Do you think, I mean, that took a long time, didn't it, crafting that particular purpose, you know, talking about end inequality by a particular time, having some data behind it, getting people together around that challenge, moving from 3 angry people to, I think they had about 40 at that gathering. How important do you think doing that slow work on purpose was to beginning the movement, Claire?
I know now it was crucial. I think at the time it did feel like really hard work because we kept going back to, but why, but why, but why? And I think I've reflected and used that approach in lots of other spheres and lots of work with other people now. But I think spending a lot of time working out the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve means that, one, we can all communicate it clearly, but it makes it simple for others also to understand what it is we're aiming to do. So I think, and it was when we got to the point, I think, of inserting the word avoidable into our goal, which was about ending avoidable health inequality. Suddenly it was like a light bulb, but there was clarity there. And I think that then enabled us to think about what we needed to be able to articulate clearly to others and what we were working on and what we were working so hard on and why. So we had lots of discussions around the head, heart, hands approach to things. So what does the data tell us? How do we feel? And then practically, what might we want to do together? So I certainly think there's huge value in taking time to work out what the problem is you're trying to solve, because I think then it does mean others can easily galvanise together around it with a lot more clarity. So yeah, it was tough, but worth it.
Paul, what's your recollection?
Well, I think, yeah, very similar to Claire's, you know, that experiencing, oh, you know, can't we go any faster and get things done? But actually, tremendously effective, I think, to have done that. And I think it goes back to a couple of discoveries that I think we made in the process of getting to the start line. One was, I think, from the housing perspective, we used to sometimes talk about the problem being that we felt like small fish in a big pond. And then it was the realization that health actually had their own pond. So, you know, that was a discovery. And the other one was that actually health, housing and social care all had their own impenetrable languages. And that's one of the reasons why none of us spoke the other's language and the communication was falling down. So I think for me, that approach was really an eye-opener. I think in terms of actually building the consensus, which was based around generating commitment and willingness to collaborate and to share. And that acknowledgement, I think at the end of the day of that event that we ran, where people were queuing up to sign the commitment, the pledge, you know, to work together. I think that was a great technique, and learning how to get people to understand that they have the same reason for getting out of bed every morning. Absolutely. They just implement their skills in a different way to a different outcome, but it can be a shared outcome and can be a better outcome. And I think it was vital that came from the group and not from us. You know, we've all, I dare say, all 4 of us, been party to trying to deliver things from the top and sitting there in 6 months' time wondering why it hasn't worked, why the message hasn't got through. And this I think was the power. It showed an effective leadership of a different sort that the collective group hadn't really been used to. And I think people actually responded to that. They warmed to that very quickly. It wasn't that sort of strong, look at me and do as I say leadership. It was softer, collaborative leadership. And I think we were learning to use it as we went along.
I think that's a really good summary, Paul, isn't it? Yeah. And I think there was a lot, I'm going to come to Margaret now, but there was a lot of curiosity, genuine curiosity. And I think holding that curiosity was really important. And all 4 of us are very action-centered people by nature. We're people who like to get things done, and it did, as Claire said earlier, felt a little bit counterintuitive going, no, we've got to just size, as Claire described, spend some time sizing this problem. And I think that relaxed people in, because I think one of the many problems I'd had in the past with kind of partnership working, as we'd called it before, was we tried to spend too much time trying to understand the other person's system. And I think what, you know, everybody recognised early days was that we didn't understand our own systems. So we had no chance of trying to understand somebody else's. But what we did have was a growing common view about things that were wrong. And as you said, Paul, it's a really important point, that passion that people realised that was the same, it's just that it had been expressed differently, was really strong. That's a very important point you mentioned. Margaret, what did you think about the purpose work?
For me, without it, I think the movement wouldn't still be flourishing, because some of the work we did was very clear in setting out what 2025 would do and what it wouldn't do, and having that clarity of purpose. So an example was, I think we committed not to do research because there was enough research in the world, but what we would do was use the research that existed to inform how we worked. The other one, which I still use, and it's extremely powerful, because the people out there, or the organisations out there, I'm not referencing North Wales on this occasion, it's just people who want to stop you doing what you think you need to do, will very often use the fact that you're duplicating it. We already do that. You know, there's no need for this new piece of work. It's not new. So our commitment to working in the cracks, as I think we described it, it was really hard for people to challenge, because nobody can do everything. And clearly there was a long-standing issue around avoidable health inequalities. No one has cracked it. But, you know, we were determined we wanted to give it a good go and do those things that we could do, because there was a moral imperative to do those things that we could and should do. So I think that was getting that sense of our moral compass and the direction of travel was well worth doing. The other thing is that I think you, Ken, said people were curious about it. Some people were, and some people were threatened. And I think we were a bit naive in that, although we all knew from different angles how the system worked, or the systems, because as you said, Paul, there are a range of systems out there. The system reacts to protect itself when it feels threatened, and it does that through the people at the top of some of those bits of the system. And so the fact that we'd created a fairly non-hierarchical structure where anybody could be a leader, and on that first leadership group, and I know it carries on to this day, you know, we had people who were frontline practitioners, and we had chief execs and everything else in between. That was something that I think made people feel really, really uncomfortable. And so for me, one of the good things that came out of that period was, because we were going slow, we had the headspace and the breathing space to actually approach the different bits of the system in different ways to try to address some of those concerns. And then we had that really strong evidence base. So I think for a lot of people, the lights went on when Rob Attenstadt from Public Health Wales and Shane Hembrow from Wales and West, and all of the other housing associations, I think, collectively came together for the first time to share the data on demand on services. And I think we all came away from that particular session with a refreshed commitment to making sure this thing succeeded.
Absolutely, and of course, when we, I think through your connections, got Ruth Hussey to speak, because she was the Chief Medical Officer for Wales, I think, at the time. And I remember one of her statistics being around you being more likely to die of loneliness and isolation than smoking 19 cigarettes a day. And I think that fits with some of the things that Claire was saying earlier. That for a social movement to work, you do need those three things affected, because we're all moved by different things, aren't we? Some of us are moved by data, Some of us are moved by emotion, and some of us are moved by just wanting to get on and do something. And I think in the past, we've probably all of us put too much emphasis on one. We've wanted to study something to the nth degree. We wanted to just get busy, or we wanted to just tell stories of how bad it is. And I think those will move 1/3 of the people in the room. So to try and get that balance, to get everybody collected, is really, really important. And I think you're right, enabling that, it did light up the room, because people were starting to say, build on what Claire said earlier, is that there's an overlap here, because we recognised it wasn't just social housing, it was low quality rented housing and the neighbourhood, the place, rather than the tenure. And there's been lots of debate about that in the housing world in the past around, is it the fact that it's a social housing home, or is it the fact of where it's located? And we know it's to do with location mainly. And I think that was one of the breakthrough things, I think, for people. That's right. So Margaret, starting with you on kind of our third and penultimate point, there might be people who are watching this, there will be people who watch this, who are thinking of starting their own social movement. It might be to do with avoidable health inequalities where they are. It might be to do with young people. There's a lot of interest in the future generations work that's happening in Wales as well, and people want to mobilise around that. What advice would you give anybody watching this who's thinking of doing that? What would be the 1 or 2 pieces of advice that you'd give to them?
Find allies that you can trust and go on the journey with, because no one person or even small group of people can do this. So you have to find people who have got that common purpose. And I think I was lucky that I already had some of those people around me, and many more who were waiting to be asked to join. And again, that strength that is there in having frontline practitioners who are maybe relatively new in their career, working alongside people that, you know, sort of in our cases were at the peak of their career or coming towards it. So trying to be polite there, but more mature people who have seen some of, you know, some of this working the first time round and can say, well, you know, that did or didn't work. So that mix is very powerful. And not underestimating how people will want to stop you, because this is so powerful.
Yeah.
Not because they're bad people, but I think because they really do feel threatened by it. Maybe they don't understand it. They've not been exposed to some of that different way of thinking around leadership, or how you can combine research with actual practical work on the ground. But it is possible. I think the other thing is, don't bite off more than you can chew in the early days. One of the things I think we learned was that we had a very loose way of organising ourselves in the first year. So we spent a lot of time, as well as it being the right thing to do in terms of thinking about outcomes and purpose and how the style of leadership, a lot of time revisiting the previous meeting, because we'd have a completely different group of people at every meeting. And it was a bit like one of the 1970s women aid collectives, where, you know, you just try to make collective decisions. Well, it really doesn't work. But what we did do was come up with a really positive light touch form of governance that enabled work to happen and gave more focus to doing than meeting for the sake of it. So I think the governance does need to happen. And once I think the governance was in the right place, some of those organisations and individuals who'd felt a bit wary of what that lot were doing opened up to us and were able to invest time, reputation, as they would have seen it, their credibility, if this new thing went horribly wrong. It made it easier to have some of those conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Margaret.
I think the other thing would be around what you do and letting people discover their own passion and have their head in a way and get on and do.
Yeah, give them a chance to go. I think the other thing, just before I pass over to Claire, I think that all of that approach built, and we can, you know, you can look at it afterwards, but it built trust and then from that proper relationships developed. And I think that's one of the things I think that is still really strong about 2025 to this day. But that governance transition is a very important point, and one probably I've not really thought about again until you mentioned it. I'd forgotten those revolving meetings. So that's a really important point. Claire, anything you'd like to add? Advice to us?
Yeah, it was just, I think it plays back to the conversation a few minutes ago about getting a clear purpose, because it's the purpose that's brought people together because they want to do something, and that's what's kept people going. And I remember an interesting conversation I had with the leader of Flintshire Council when we were a couple of years in, and it was after we'd managed to have Vaughan Gething come and speak at an event. And he said to me, I wondered a lot, he said, about what you're doing there and who's giving you permission and where it fits in the local authority and health board structures across North Wales and what the accountability is. But he said, I can see now that really we did just need to let people get on and do what they felt were the right things to do. And probably that if you'd come and asked permission, we would have killed it off. So I guess the other thing for me, and I suppose this is part of my character as well, sometimes it's good to ask for forgiveness, not for permission. So that's what I'd say to people who are...
act. Thank you, Claire, that's lovely. Paul, finally from you, advice?
Yeah, Claire, makes me feel like we were rebels with a cause.
We still are.
makes me feel slightly dangerous. I think if there was one piece of advice, I think it was a pearl of wisdom that came out of the work we did on systems leadership. And that is that in order to lead collaboratively, you have to leave your egos at the door. And let's face it, as organisational leaders, we're all guilty of thinking that we know best. We go into meetings knowing what solutions are before you have the discussion sometimes, and you have to be persuaded. And I think that again was another really brilliant concept of actually, this isn't about us. It's something I think maybe on the as we go on we can talk about later. The willingness to collaborate and being able to see what you can get from a group in that way. I think the USP, the unique selling point, if you like, for 2025 has also been about its engagement, involvement, commitment. One follows the other from those. And you could almost see that on the launch event that we had. We started with engaging people. We got their involvement. By the end of the day, they were committed. And I think that was a really worthwhile sort of journey. I think the other key thing that has to be said is facilitation. And I think Claire, Margaret and myself recognising that we hadn't got time for this. None of us individually or even collectively were going to be able to find the time or the resources to implement this in the way that it needed doing. And I think, to our credit, I think we realised that we all felt this was sufficiently important that we needed to put some resource into it. And so we went off and found this bloke. What was his name? Yeah. To
whatever happened to him.
I know, yeah, to do the facilitation. But that was a really important move. And I think when we went back to our respective groups and local authorities, housing associations, the health board, people backed our judgment on that. And we got other people coming in, chipping in then to fund it. And I think probably each of us probably put in more than we perhaps should in terms of contribution, but we didn't mind because we were seeing progress and we knew that I just always had this feeling that in my stomach that this was going to work and it was going to be different and we were at last going to get somewhere. So crack on.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for saying that. And I think one of the things that we've all learned subsequently is that whichever way you look at it, this kind of leadership and the way that Margaret and Claire have both described it, it's collective leadership, isn't it? And it's also a community. What you're doing is building a community of leaders, and that needs a kind of almost a community development worker. And I suppose that's kind of the role that I've played and that Dougal have played along that path, is because I think the other thing perhaps that we haven't talked about so much, and I think that's probably more reflective of the characters of the three of you, but we should probably emphasise, is that this is hard work and it requires a lot of stamina. So it isn't, neither of you are sitting there thinking, oh, I've got a couple of days free a week that I want to fill with doing a social movement. Everyone was really busy. And I think that probably builds on Margaret's point. You want willing and busy people, don't you? People who are working already very hard. And I think to keep that going and to maintain that movement, and now we're sort of 5 years in, it does require stamina. I think, those of you who know me know that I think that's kind of probably one of the most underrated leadership qualities generally, is that people who do well generally just stick at it. And I think that's an important part, and perhaps you do sometimes need someone who'll help chivvy that along in the background. I think that's quite important. So I'm coming to the final part of our discussion this morning, and I'll start with you, Paul. What do you think that 2025 should be giving its attention to over the next 5 years, looking forward?
I guess really for me, there are three things that have emerged or been cemented in my mind as priorities over this difficult year that we've been all enjoying. I think they might have been different had we been doing this a year ago before the pandemic. But one is aging well. I think that remains a distant dream for many people, and many of us, looking ahead to our own futures. It's care homes have been high profile during the year for the wrong reasons, and I think unfortunately, we've had this defence from the government that we threw a protective ring around care homes, and it's painfully obvious that they hadn't. They also seemed painfully obvious to me that they hadn't got a clue how care homes worked, and the difficulties around resources and so on. And I found that probably we ran a care home at North Wales Housing, which sadly closed about 6 months after I left. And it was run really well, but it was almost impossible to run in a sustainable way because of various decisions taken by local authorities, government, etc. And instead of making it easier and making it better, it just kept getting more difficult. And you could see that this may not be a viable business venture for too much longer. And I don't think that's changed. If anything, it's got worse. And you can't see people coming into the care home market to see opportunities there to deliver great services for our old people. And the best examples of that, again, are coming from probably the housing sector in that respect. But we really do need to get a grip of the aging well argument. I think mental health, again, I'm sure Margaret's probably better placed than I am to talk about that, but there at least has been a greater awareness of mental health and a much wider openness, I think, to discuss it, but we're still well away from where it needs to be. And with the pressures that everybody's mental health has been on during the year, it's just exacerbated what is a significant problem that's being stretched further and further. And then the third one really is, I guess, it's a positive one really, and it's about a generosity of spirit that we've seen across the year that I think we need to tap into really and make the most of. Individuals at a community level and organisations at the corporate level have been seen to work together in ways that we haven't noticed before. They really come together. I think one example with this being, for instance, in Merseyside, where I've become involved, all the housing associations agreed that in order to help the local authorities take homeless people off the streets, and in particular out of bed and breakfast and inadequate accommodation during the pandemic, every vacancy would go to homeless households. And that seemed a little bit revolutionary. It also put paid to the myth that it can't be done. You know, you can't sort of deal with homelessness that quickly, but it's been very effective. And that's a good example. And something that somebody I heard saying on a virtual conference, organisations have had very little time to implement radical change, but they've done so. They've done so because they've learned to work at Corona speed, which is I think the new term for the pace that we can work at if we feel we really have to. And I think that's been impressive. So what I'd love to see is that generosity of spirit continue beyond the pandemic.
It's wonderful, thank you, Paul. And there's a lot to unpack in there. There's perhaps even another conversation, perhaps between the four of us about that, because I think there's a lot to reflect on about what we've focused on during this time, and how urgent they have been, and how long term we can be with that kind of endeavour, really, and mindset. So I think that's really important. The points around mental health are also well made, and I'm sure perhaps Claire and Margaret might pick those up. Claire, what are your thoughts and hopes for the next 5 years for 2025?
I mean, I think Paul covered a lot there, so I'm only going to really just pick up two key things. I think one for me is getting our voice heard more so that we influence for change. And I'm saying that specifically because we've got a great moment in time in Wales. There are elections for the Senedd next May, and it's a great opportunity with a new government elected, irrespective of their political colour or who they are, to make sure that we get the voice of 2025 heard, and that we share broadly what we've learned and the good practice we've developed and the areas of change that we can be really proud of that we've influenced. And so I suppose the second point linked into that is to keep momentum going and to keep the practice developing on the ground. Because as Margaret said, one of the huge strengths has been all sorts of people from all sorts of organisations who have very different job roles and very different experiences coming together to change things on the ground that make a real impact for people, but also I think to be able to use some of the other people in the network who've got the ability to influence, to change practice inside organisations at a more senior level. That's been the beauty of it, is having all of those people in the room together, because there's always somebody who knows somebody or somebody who knows a route into something. So we really do have to continue that, because I think that's what's helped shape some of the successes.
So keep the community developing and growing and keeping that diversity in the room, because of course you can always lean to the folk you know, can't you, which is the other side, I guess.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Claire. Margaret, final word from you.
Reflecting on 2020, we're not out of the woods yet, but you know, I think we're maybe coming to the end of the path, hopefully, fingers crossed, as we sit here on the 1st of December. I can sum that year up in one word, which is exclusion. And how lots of the cracks that 2025 committed to work in, which I think were probably hidden to a lot of people. Some of them were really old cracks going back many decades, others that intergenerational exclusion, others were cracks which had been forced through the austerity of, it was the previous 5 years when we got going, it's now over a decade. It's about how we keep reminding people that, you know, they may be okay even during the pandemic. Some people, lots of people have been okay, they've not been impacted by it, but I think a lot of people have, and in ways which are yet to reveal themselves. And I think what 2025 has a massive opportunity to do is twofold. Firstly, to hold the mirror up to those people who can help heal some of that damage over the short and medium term going forward. So I think Clare's point about influencing the small p political agenda is vital. And I think secondly, it is to use the evidence and the learning from both the work of 2025, but also stuff that's out there from previous recessions and other major society impacting events. It's not just, you know, the war and other things, to ensure that that learning's put into practice on the ground so that we don't have other generations lost as some have been in the past. And I think when we looked as back in 2015 at that data set around who was actually living in social rented housing or private rented sector housing, very often it was the people that were on the rough end of some of that dislocation that had happened over previous decades. So we've created challenges in locations that wouldn't have been there previously when it was easier to get social housing and you aspired to have it because it was a public good. And I think we need to be taking up some of that learning and making some of those arguments afresh.
I think they're really important and powerful points for us to end on. I think we've talked a lot this morning, haven't we, about the importance of purpose, about bringing like-minded people together, but not becoming too focused and too similar, so you might miss something. I think, you know, linking it to our current situation in terms of the global pandemic, the speed of change that Paul talked about, but also the final very important point you're making there, Margaret, that now some of the inequalities that some folk have known about for a long time are more exposed, are more clear, and sadly more people are probably going to suffer from those, particularly around mental health and well-being. We're seeing that already 30-40% increase in demands on those services. We're not going to go anywhere near addressing those challenges on our own, are we, either as individuals or as individual organisations. No matter how good we are, no matter how well governed we are, however well run we are, we've got to find a way of working collaboratively. And I suppose our journey so far in 2025 is that we've learned a few things along the way, good and bad. But if you are going to achieve anything, you need to work in a high trust and high purpose kind of environment and work together collectively and keep going. So I just wanted to end by thanking all three of you, not just for your time this morning, but the bravery that you showed over 5 years ago to begin this process. It is making a difference to people's lives, and most of the folk whose lives will have been changed as a result of this movement probably will never know you or know your name. So I just wanted to say thank you, Diolch yn fawr, Paul. Have a great day.